Yo, what's going on, APUSH peeps? I have chapter 9 for you today of Give Me Liberty. This one is on the market revolution. If you look at all these text bubbles here are all the things you'll be learning about and more to come in this video. So let's get started. All right, we're going to start off talking about what the heck is the market revolution. Well, it is when the U.S. saw economic changes which saw work done increasingly outside the home, and there's also improvements in transportation. So more and more people are no longer making things in their homes. They're now making them, they begin to make them in factories. And we also see drastic changes in transportation, such as canals and railroads. Roads in the early 19th century were incredibly primitive. To go from Cincinnati, Ohio to New York City, it would take 50 days to get there. It's about not even an 8-hour car ride today, but it would take 50 days back then. That's how poor many of the roads were. Okay, so we see new improvements for transportation and communication systems, such as the canal, the railroad, and the telegraph. Originally, most roads were built by local and state governments or private companies, and these are because most roads were only within a state. Remember, that is called intrastate trade. The federal government did not fund intrastate improvements. They only funded or improvements that involve 2 or more states. The National Road is an example of this, which connected Maryland to the Old Northwest, originally Wheeling, Ohio. And this is also called the Cumberland Road. The Claremont was a steamship that allowed for travel against the current of a river, which was a huge boost for trade, especially along rivers like the Mississippi. And then we have the Erie Canal, which is a huge construction project in the state of New York, right by my town of Buffalo. And here is a little town near me about 20 minutes away called Lockport, which got its name because of the locks. And this connected Albany to Buffalo, and it was 363 miles long. And it also connected New York City via the Hudson River all the way up to Albany. And then you could, through the Great Lakes, get all the way over to the Old Northwest or the Midwest. And it was built entirely by New York State, no federal funding whatsoever. Actually, President James Monroe vetoed funding for the Erie Canal because it was an example of intrastate commerce. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad began construction in 1828, and here is a visual of that. And by 1860, by the dawn of the Civil War, we see 30,000 miles of railroads laid throughout this country. In 1844, the telegraph, the first message was sent, and the first message was "What Hath God Wrought?" That is an excellent book, too, if you ever want to read it. It's all really about this time period, antebellum America. And this leads to a massive increase in the spread of information. Westward expansion increased rapidly after the War of 1812. Remember, many Native Americans, they no longer provided much resistance, as the British did not, because they left many posts or forts. Farmers began to move to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. They founded cotton plantations. And with this free migration by farmers, also came the forced migration of slaves that were forced against their will to go and work on these cotton plantations. In 1819, we have the Adams-Onis Treaty, which was between the United States and Spain, named after Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, and the U.S. gains Florida from Spain. And many prominent politicians during this time were born on the East Coast and moved to western states. People like Henry Clay from Virginia, Andrew Jackson from the Carolinas, because he was born on the border between North and South Carolina, and Abe Lincoln from Kentucky all move further west. So about the Cotton Kingdom, the Deep South, those states I just mentioned, they had very favorable climate for cotton. And one reason for the increase of cotton production was the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. This drastically increased the demand for slavery and cotton. It was a machine that was able to separate the seeds from cotton at a much faster rate, and owners and plantation owners were able to make large amounts of money. In 1808, we see the end of the international slave trade. That was the earliest it could be banned according to the Constitution, and it was in that year, and this led to an increase in the domestic slave trade, and a huge number of families were broken up. Slave coffles was a forced march of slaves to the Deep South, where they would be tied together and forced to walk, and this continued to lead to the breakup of families and communities, and this is something that is explored in the very well-known book that we'll talk about in a future chapter, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And as the U.S. expanded westward, so did cotton plantations in the South, and with it, slavery as well. Banking and transportation systems in the South revolved around cotton. You would have banks that would finance the purchase of new plantations and slaves, and transportation systems were created to transport cotton and benefit plantation owners. The Old Northwest and the East became more interconnected than the South did during this time. And we have key inventions you should be familiar with, such as the steel plow by this dude, John Deere. This made it easier to break ground for farming into the soil. The McCormick Reaper was invented. This increased the harvest rate for farmers. They were able to gather their crops much more quickly. And the West tended to produce a lot more wheat than the East did, and the Eastern farmers focused on things like dairy, fruit, and vegetables. So we begin to see each region kind of have a specialization when it came to farming. The South is going to focus on cash crops, such as cotton. The East is going to focus on dairy, fruit, and veggies, and the West is going to focus on wheat. Many cities began to grow that became important in trade. Cities like Cincinnati, my old hometown. It's a great city, one of the best in this country. If you've never been there, what are you waiting for? Plus, they're home of the wonderful Cincinnati Reds, and St. Louis as well. And they were strategically located in the Midwest, and for Cincinnati in particular, along the Ohio River. Goods were produced more quickly as the process was broken down into several steps. Samuel Slater is known as the father of the American factory system. He came over from England and he memorized plans for the spinning jenny and he replicated it from his memory. In Lowell, Massachusetts, we see the emergence of textile factories that were built along waterways, things like rivers and little waterfalls to help power a lot of the machinery. Interchangeable parts are going back to Eli Whitney. This was invented by him as well as the cotton gin. And this led to goods being produced with identical parts and therefore easier to replace if any of them broke down, as well as being mass produced at a higher rate. I always think of these as cookie cutters. If I tell you to make a star-shaped cookie, you and I might make a different shaped cookie if we are just using our hands. But if I hand you a cookie cutter, all of your cookies would look the exact same. That's the idea of the interchangeable part. And this allowed, again, for the mass production of goods using identical parts. And factories in the first half of the 19th century were limited mostly to New England and the Northeast. Other areas, they still were done in smaller scale shops or homes. Factories prior to the Civil War, mostly in the Northeast. Leisure and work time became increasingly separated in city life, again, because you have the emergence of factories. Wages were paid in hourly rates, and this is where you really kind of see the modern day workday. Let's jump back over to Lowell. In Lowell, Massachusetts, we had the Lowell factory system, and this employed local farmers' daughters in their factories. These were single women. They lived in the boarding houses, and these boarding houses has rules that regulated behavior. There was curfews, and there were also lecture halls for them to become educated. This did afford an opportunity for single women to make income on their own and to have some sort of economic independence. Immigrants prior to the Civil War began to come over in large numbers in the 1840s and 1860s, and in particular, they're mostly Germans from the 1840s to the 1860s, and in particular, they're mostly Germans and Irish. They tended to settle in the North and the Midwest, not in the South, because of plantations and slaves are the main source of labor down there. And there was a huge loss of land in Europe that forced many to immigrate to the United States. Now, specifically when it comes to Irish, many of them came over due to the Irish potato famine. 1 million Irish people died during the 1840s and 50s, and 1 million more emigrated mostly to the United States. The Irish immigrants played a very large role in building the American infrastructure. They worked on things like canals and railroads, particularly the Erie Canal, and they tended to settle in cities in the Northeast, cities like New York City and Boston. Think of the Boston Celtics, the basketball team. They tended to settle in urban areas. The Germans, they tended to be craftsmen and farmers, and they tended to settle out on the frontier in areas like Cincinnati, Ohio, and St. Louis, and out in the Midwest where they could farm. Now, with this increase in immigration, we have a rise of nativism or nativist movement. This is hatred and fear of foreigners, and a lot of this goes back to religion. Irish tend to be Catholics, and some Germans too. So there's heavy nativism against Catholics. Things like parochial schools are all Catholic schools, and this fear of the Pope having too much control in politics and political life really led to the nativist movement. There's also arguments that immigrants stole jobs and they voted Democratic. And you see here a very famous political cartoon. You see Irish whiskey the Lagerbier, which represents Germans, and in their hands as they're running away, they have the ballot box. Because they tended to vote Democratic, they were accused of, stealing elections and jobs because they would work for lower wages. The idea of a corporation began to emerge during this time, in which owners are not liable for a company's debts, so you can invest in a company without fear of losing your money if the company goes broke. And in the Massachusetts State Supreme Court decision, Commonwealth versus Hunt, the court ruled that labor unions are legal. Manifest destiny is this idea that is the God-given right for the U.S. to expand from coast to coast, and this will really be a huge factor in the next several chapters as we study. And the West provided opportunities for individuals and families to move in tough economic times. So this is known as the safety valve theory. No matter how bad things seem to be out on the East Coast, if you're working in a factory, no matter what, there was this idea that you could always pack up and move out west and become a farmer and become economically independent. There was an abundance of land, you were very far from factory labor, and again, the opportunity for economic independence. A group of writers emerged during this time known as transcendentalists, and they focused on the individual rather than social traditions. You got dudes like Ralph Waldo Emerson and this guy, Henry David Thoreau, who might have one of the sweetest neck beards I've ever seen. Look at that, not a single bit of hair on his chin. It's all on his neck. That's impressive, huh? And Emerson will become well known for criticizing materialistic possessions, and he argued for individuals to focus on nature. And this is a theme we'll see again in the 1920s and the 1950s, that writers will criticize middle class or materialistic values. And Thoreau, he tried to reconnect with nature, and for 2 years he moved to Walden Pond and lived by himself, and he wrote about it in his book, Walden. The Second Great Awakening, it's called the second because there is another one. Now, this was a religious revival aimed at low church attendance, just like the first one. And the main player here is Charles Grandison Finney, and he was an evangelist in New York State, between New York City and Buffalo, really, especially along the Erie Canal. Like the First Great Awakening, the second saw an increase in religious sects or denominations. I do have a video in the description that compares the two awakenings. Unlike the First Great Awakening, however, the second preached free will by individuals, and it will also, as we'll see in the coming chapters, encourage individuals to try to achieve perfection, and it will really influence a lot of reform movements. One of the ideas of the Second Great Awakening was that salvation could be attained through faith and good deeds, and greed was seen as selfish and as a sin. And revivals were popular in areas affected by the market economy, by the market revolution, again, in cities that developed along the Erie Canal, as I mentioned. The Church of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons, they were founded by Joseph Smith in New York, and there was a focus on family and the rejection of alcohol. One of the earlier aspects of Mormonism was the practice of polygamy, or a man having many wives. So this upset Smith's neighbors, and he was forced to move. And he did so to Illinois, and he was actually in jail, and he was murdered while in jail. Needing a leader, Brigham Young comes along, and he leads the Mormons to Salt Lake City, Utah, where they established residency, and to this day there is a high Mormon population in Utah. There is also a college, Brigham Young University, or BYU, named after Brigham Young in Utah. John Jacob Astor became wealthy by shipping furs all over the world, and he was worth about $10 million at the time of his death, which would be the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in today's dollars. Might have been the richest man to ever live, and he's an example of a self-made man. There will be many more that we'll talk about in the coming chapters. Blacks often lived in the poorest sections of cities and were subject to violence, especially in the North. Free blacks lived in poor sections of cities and were often the subject of white mob violence. Richard Allen was a famous preacher that founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church because he was barred from praying at an all-white altar rail at his church, so he founded his own religion. And blacks were often barred from skilled employment because they would compete with whites for jobs. So they often only received the worst or lowest paying jobs in the North. Some states, such as Illinois, even barred free blacks from entering the state. Cult of domesticity, this emerged out of the market economy, and this is where women were expected to foster love and friendship. And this is very similar to the idea of Republican motherhood from the post-Revolutionary War. This really kind of idealizes women staying at home and being good wives and mothers. Married women could not sign contracts in their own name, and work outside the home was limited to mostly domestic servants, factory workers, and seamstresses for women. And to be a middle class woman, it was really expected that you remain at home. That was a sign of economic independence, that a middle class woman would not have to work outside the home. The market revolution increased the gap between the wealthy and the poor, and those that couldn't pay debts were sent to jail. That's kind of something that, at least for me, seems so foreign today, that if you're in debt and you can't pay, you would go to jail. But this was typical back in the 1800s. Working men's parties emerged, and they hoped to gain political support for free education, and they sought to end imprisonment for debt, which eventually does happen. And Lowell women in 1834 went on strike. They walked off the job for higher wages. And the market revolution increased opportunities for white men, but limited opportunities for women and blacks, as we have seen. All right, let's do a quick recap. Market revolution, know what it is. The steel plow, McCormick reaper, cotton gin, interchangeable parts, definitely know all of them and the impact of them. The Lowell factory system, Irish and German immigrants, where did they settle? What were the fears of nativism? Why did that happen? Nativism, what is it? What are the reasons for it? What was the idea of transcendentalists? Who were two famous transcendentalist authors? The Second Great Awakening, what were the reasons for and impacts of it? And Mormons as well. Why did they go to Utah? All right, guys, look forward to seeing you right back here for Chapter 10, which is my favorite chapter in the entire book. We're going to talk a lot about Andrew Jackson and my boy, Henry Clay. So I look forward to seeing you right back here. I thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.